When Grandpa was admitted to the ICU, I thought my parents would rush to his side. After all, he had raised my dad when Grandma passed away, sacrificed everything to put him through college, and even paid for our house when we couldn't afford it. But when I called my parents to tell them about Grandpa's condition, their tone was distant, almost annoyed. "We already have plans," Mom said casually. "We're flying to Greece tomorrow. It's been a stressful year, we need this vacation." I stood in the cold hospital hallway, phone pressed against my ear, struggling to process what she'd just said. Grandpa's heart was failing, his condition critical, and my parents were going on vacation. The doctor had told me Grandpa needed immediate treatment, including surgery that wasn't covered by insurance. I was only a few months into my new job, barely making enough to pay rent, but I couldn't let him lie there without help. So I signed the forms, my hand trembling, and took full financial responsibility. The next few weeks blurred together, nights sleeping on the hard bench beside his bed, days juggling calls from work, trying to sound normal while my heart broke seeing him connected to tubes and machines. Every time I walked in, his eyes lit up just a little. "You're here again, sweetheart," he would whisper weakly, his fingers barely gripping mine. One afternoon, he asked me softly, "Where's your father?" I didn't know how to answer. Should I tell him the truth, that his only son was drinking cocktails on a beach while he lay dying? I forced a smile and said, "They're sorting out some things, Grandpa. They'll come soon." But deep inside, something shattered. The guilt of lying to him hurt more than the exhaustion or the hospital bills piling up in my bag. I worked double shifts, borrowed money, even sold my old car to cover the costs. When he asked me why I looked so tired, I laughed it off, saying work was just busy. He didn't need to know that his medical bills had drained my savings. Then came the night I'll never forget. Grandpa's breathing grew shallow, the machines beeping louder than usual. I held his hand and whispered, "It's okay, Grandpa. You can rest." Tears blurred my vision as he smiled faintly and said, "You're the only one who stayed." Those were his last words. I broke down beside him, the weight of everything crashing down at once, the loneliness, the anger, the betrayal. My parents returned from their vacation 3 days later, sun-kissed and cheerful, acting like nothing had happened. "You should have called us earlier," Dad said, as if I hadn't spent nights begging them to come. Mom sighed dramatically, complaining about the funeral arrangements being too plain. I said nothing, just watched them talk about catering and flowers while I quietly clutched the folder of unpaid hospital bills. Weeks passed, and life went on. Or at least it tried to. I went back to work, my body on autopilot, but my mind stuck in that hospital room. Then one day, a lawyer called. He said Grandpa's will was being read, and that all family members were required to attend. My parents were unusually cheerful that morning, dressing up like they were heading to a celebration rather than a legal meeting. Dad promised he'd take care of us, Mom said confidently, fixing her hair. I didn't say anything, I just wanted closure, some peace to finally let him go. As we sat in the lawyer's office, the air felt thick with tension. Grandpa's portrait sat on the desk beside a stack of papers. The lawyer cleared his throat and began reading. My parents sat upright, smiling smugly. "To my beloved son and daughter-in-law," the lawyer started. Mom grinned, squeezing Dad's hand. But the next line wiped the smile off their faces. "You both chose distance when I needed love. Therefore, I leave you nothing but the memories of what could have been." The room fell silent. Mom blinked in disbelief while Dad's jaw clenched. The lawyer continued, "To my granddaughter, who stood by me when no one else did, I leave my entire estate and remaining assets, including the house, savings, and family business." I froze, unable to breathe. My parents turned to me, their faces twisted in shock. "What?" Mom shrieked. "This must be a mistake. We're his family." The lawyer looked at her calmly. He was very clear. He said she was his true family. Tears welled up in my eyes, not because of the inheritance, but because those words meant he had seen everything. He had known, all those moments when I thought he didn't notice, the nights I cried quietly beside his bed, the lies I told to protect his heart, he knew it all. Mom slammed her hand on the table, her voice trembling with rage. "You manipulated him. You made him change the will." I looked at her, my voice steady but soft. "I didn't ask for anything. I just didn't leave him alone." She glared at me as if I had stolen something sacred, but I didn't feel victorious. I felt grief and justice intertwined, like two threads finally coming together after years of being apart. Dad didn't say a word, just looked down, shame flickering briefly in his eyes before disappearing. The day of the will reading changed everything, but what followed after was a storm I never saw coming. Mom's scream from that office still echoed in my ears days later. The look on her face, part disbelief, part fury, burned itself into my memory. Dad tried to stay calm, but I could see the cracks forming behind his blank stare. I didn't say anything, I didn't need to. Grandpa had spoken for me, even in death. Still, the peace I expected never came. Instead, silence filled our home, heavy and cold, as my parents avoided me like a stranger. That night, Mom barged into my room without knocking. Her eyes were swollen, mascara streaked down her cheeks. "How could you do this to us?" she hissed. "After everything we've done for you, you take our future away." I stared at her, too tired to argue. "I didn't take anything," I said quietly. "Grandpa just left what he wanted to leave." Her lips trembled with rage. "He was manipulated. You were always his favorite, always pretending to be the innocent one while we carried the real burdens." I almost laughed, but the lump in my throat wouldn't let me. "You mean while you were on vacation?" I said softly. She froze, guilt flickering for half a second before her face hardened again. "You think you're better than us? You'll see how fast that money disappears." Then she slammed the door so hard that the frame cracked. The following days were a blur of legal paperwork and relatives calling me suddenly as if I had become some prize they wanted to claim. Cousins I hadn't heard from in years started dropping messages about how Grandpa had always wanted a close family and how they'd love to reconnect. But beneath the polite words, I could sense their greed. Everyone wanted a piece of the man they had long forgotten. I refused to let them taint his memory. I sold the old business he left me, he had known I didn't want to run it, and donated a good portion of the profits to the hospital that had cared for him. It felt right. Grandpa had always said money meant nothing unless it healed or helped. One evening, I went back to his house, the one he'd left to me. The air smelled faintly of his aftershave and old books. Everything was exactly as he'd left it. The armchair by the fireplace, his reading glasses resting on the side table, a half-finished crossword puzzle lying beside them. I sat in that chair and felt the ache of missing him. I wished he could have seen that I wasn't broken anymore, that I had found strength through his love. The house was quiet, but I could almost hear his voice, warm and patient, telling me to keep going, to forgive but never forget. Mom and Dad, however, didn't find peace. Their lives began to unravel in ways I couldn't have imagined. Dad's business deals fell apart. He had borrowed heavily, expecting Grandpa's inheritance to bail him out. Mom started selling her jewelry, whispering to neighbors about betrayal and family curses. Whenever she saw me in town, she'd turn her face away, pretending not to know me. It hurt, but I also knew this was the path they had chosen the moment they abandoned Grandpa in that hospital bed. I had learned to live with loss, but they were now learning to live with regret. A few weeks later, the lawyer called again. He said there was something Grandpa had asked him to deliver personally, a letter addressed to my granddaughter. My heart raced as I opened the envelope. Inside, written in his shaky handwriting, were words that felt like a gentle hug. "I knew you would stay. Not because you wanted anything, but because you understand love the way I once did when I was young. You will be hurt by their anger, but don't let it harden you. The world will test your kindness. Hold it close, even when it burns." I cried for a long time that night, clutching the letter like it was a lifeline. Everything I had done, the sleepless nights, the hospital bills, the loneliness, suddenly felt worth it. I wasn't alone in the end. He had seen me, truly seen me. From that day forward, I stopped living in the shadow of guilt and started living the way he had taught me, to love quietly, to forgive slowly, and to never measure people by their wealth. Months passed, and I began restoring Grandpa's old home. I planted roses in the garden where he used to sit with his tea, and every morning, I watched the sun rise through the same window he loved. Sometimes I'd see a couple walking their dog down the street, or hear children laughing, and I'd think of him smiling somewhere, proud and at peace. Then one afternoon, as I was sorting through his study, I found a small box tucked behind some books. Inside was a photograph, me as a child sitting on his lap, both of us laughing, and a short note on the back that read, "Love is proven in presence, not promises." My chest tightened as I traced the words. That sentence captured everything. My parents had promised to care, to be there, to love, but when it mattered most, they were absent. I hadn't promised anything, but I had stayed. Not long after, Mom showed up at the gate. Her face looked tired, older somehow. She didn't shout this time. "I came to talk," she said softly. I hesitated but opened the door. She stood awkwardly in the living room, looking around at the house she once wanted for herself. He really left it all to you, she murmured, touching the old clock on the wall. I never thought he'd do that. Her voice cracked. He always said family was everything. I just didn't think we'd end up like this. I looked at her for a long moment and said, it didn't have to be this way. Tears welled in her eyes, and for the first time, I saw regret, not anger. She whispered, I'm sorry, and before I could respond, she left.